Welcome back, Postgame. Joining us now is a man who wrote a great book called Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. He's a proprietor of a great Patreon, which I am a patron of. He's also a logic professor at Georgia State University System at Perimeter College. And he's also a regular contributor at The Jacobin and a weekly guest on The Debunk. I'm getting exhausted explaining all of this. He's also the inspiration behind this song by Moondug. I want to go to mockery really badly.
I will.
So please go.
Okay.
You got to restrain me. Debunk all of it. Logical analysis. You're going to show us how to argue that. Go.
This is based on data from a bunch of different countries. There's abundant evidence that at this point that's bullshit. Breaking down these right-wing arguments and looking at how they're supposed to fit together.
Okay. Break it down. Break it down. Break it down. Ben, are you ready to break it down?
Absolutely.
By the way, you're sounding very good tonight. Back with the Skype connection.
Yes.
Let's play this clip. And I'm sure, and just a warning to everybody who gets triggered about criticism of the People's Republic of China. You're going to hear a little bit of it. This is Mike Bloomberg, who incidentally, there's another clip of him going around talking about how taxing poor people is good for them. Truly loathsome human being. Here's Michael Bloomberg. I believe this is from earlier this year. Or I don't know the date on this.
I'm not sure when it's from. It was going around late last week and over the weekend, and I think that's when most people saw it. I'm not sure when the interview was recorded.
I think it might be pretty recent.
All right. Here is Mike Bloomberg coming in on the
So
debunk.
the United States currently accounts for about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Yes. China accounts for roughly 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. How do we, even if we get to net zero, how do you get China, India, and the other countries to be good partners?
China is doing a lot. Yes, they're still building a bunch of coal-fired power plants.
And they're still burning coal.
Yes, they are. But they are now moving plants away from the cities. The Communist Party wants to stay in power in China, and they listen to the public. When the public says, I can't breathe the air, Xi Jinping is not a dictator. He has to satisfy his constituents, or he's not going to survive.
He's not a dictator?
No, he has a constituency to answer to.
He doesn't have a vote. He doesn't have a democracy. He's not held
mean
accountable by voters.
If his advisors
is the check on him just a revolution?
Yeah, I can have a revolution. No government survives without the will of the majority of its people.
There was a lot of interesting things to unpack there, but first I've got some ideas, but first do the general debunk, Ben, please.
Sure. So there is a germ of truth in the insane thing that he just said, which is something that David Hume pointed out. It's called Hume's paradox, which is roughly that, we see in his time as well as ours all over the world, large numbers of people submitting to domination by relatively small numbers of people. And it is, of course, true that if people no longer put up with that, it wouldn't happen. Right? This is the kind of underlying thought behind both Workers of the World Unite and We Are the 99%. Right. That there are, that if the oppressed majority doesn't put up with its oppression anymore, it could end. So the question is, well, why doesn't it? And that's an incredibly complicated question. And if you really want to get into thinking about that, you can start thinking about Gramsci and hegemony and stuff like that. But there's also a very simple logical leap that the former mayor is engaged in here, which is something called the fallacy of division, which is where you say the whole thing has some property, therefore each individual part of it does. So, I can see this brick wall with my naked eye, so therefore I must be able to see all the molecules within it with my naked eye. That just obviously doesn't follow. Analogy. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Doesn't follow. So just because, sure, it is very often true that even with governments that even with the most oppressive and authoritarian governments in the world, it is often true that majority of the population at any given time might see the government as legitimate, or at the very least as something that you can't do anything about, like a force of nature. This, by the way, this is something you get into very nicely in your forthcoming book, the way that the function of reactionaries is often to give people exactly that impression that, that social facts are like natural facts, that there's just, it's like complaining about the weather. What can you do about it? So it is true that people, oftentimes the majority of people, at least accept whatever government they're under, no matter how authoritarian, or think that it's legitimate, or at the very least that there's nothing can be done about it. But it doesn't follow from that the majority of the public approves of any individual policy decision it makes, even in governments way less authoritarian than the People's Republic of China, in its sort of current, post-Dengist, hyper-capitalist form.
Right.
Even governments way less authoritarian, way more democratic than China, government and corporate decision makers make decisions that most of the population hates all the time, just because they accept that the government is legitimate, or at least is there's nothing that can be done about it. That doesn't mean they approve of everything it does.
That's right. 100%. And I think the two tangents I just want to take a couple minutes with you on are, one, I think that we really do need to recognize that people like Mike Bloomberg view China, and actually I would say Singapore through China, as really what they want. And what he's talking about, and also I could see how they justify it too, because look, even again, as I said in the beginning of the show with the golden straitjacket, look, maybe they want it. We're still in, countries that have, traditional like kind of elections and parliamentary democracy. So we'll still give you, the ideal like of the 1990s, like an extraordinarily narrow corporate-owned choice, which is still obviously most of electoral politics today, except, now it's like, well, it's the discredited, exhausted corporate neoliberalism, or it's neo-fascist authoritarianism, or it's some type of resurgent, progressive social democracy, which of course they hate the most. But that point, more broadly, that yes, the China utilizes incredibly sophisticated methods of public opinion measurement, and they actually are very attentive to people's needs in certain areas. And of course, yes, the PRC has lifted a ton of people out of poverty.
No question.
And has achieved some great things. They also, and I like, I believe this is Pepe Escobar, who's much more, I think Pepe is, totally brilliant. That's why I have him on. I think he's more China sympathetic than I am, but he calls it neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics.
Right.
Right. And so, and you also, and then of course you do, you do have these like cultural cleansing programs of the Uyghurs and the Tibetans and so on. Look, this is just real. Let's just, be real, just as I'm not, just as there's plenty of people here who are xenophobic and conspiratorial and delusional. But the serious through line of a Mike Bloomberg is not only is it an embarrassing double standard with a Bernie Sanders and a Maduro, and not only is all of the logical debunk that you just did absolutely correct, it's that this is a zone, this is Davos world that does see the management and delivery techniques of a lean, so narrow, it fits into every single nook and cranny of your life for your own good, mixed with hyper capitalism. This is what they see. This is their future. This is, they want this. This is another thing I said in my book, the choices between, Hungary station as neo-authoritarian xenophobic reaction, Singapore, and then, Finland station as at least a symbol, of Lenin arriving as at least a symbol of kind of actual human liberation.
Yeah, no, look, once you pose the question, it answers itself. Would Michael Bloomberg like something like the social credit system? Of course he would.
I'm shocked he didn't try to do it himself.
Yes.
What another great way of kicking poor people out of their homes. What other great way of terrorizing young men of color with policing. I mean, that, and listen to his, that's the difference, right? I mean, Giuliani or Trump, it's that raw racism, it's like, yeah, of course we put the police in certain fucking neighborhoods, right?
Right.
Bloomberg said, well, statistically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, also pay attention to the wording he uses, that, there are certain constituencies that they have to pay attention to. That's a very different claim than that they have to do what the majority of the people want.
Very different claim. And I believe, and one of those constituencies is him.
Right, exactly. Which is why,
as a global oligarch.
Yeah, which is why he identifies. I mean, even back when when China had had a system with much more socialist characteristics and less and less of the sort of capitalism with with sort of corporate neoliberal authoritarian characteristics. Even back in the 70s when Nixon visited China, he infamously said that, he really, to his advisors, that, he really admired the way that Mao was able to run such a large country while being able to consult so few people.
Right.
And of course, that's back when, when Chinese communism, was in full force. And now
when there actually was Chinese communism.
Yeah, when there actually was
right.
Chinese communism, that you didn't just have a system where they have Walmart, they produce half the stuff at Walmart, where there's a certain amount of state shepherding of economic planning on the highest levels, but in many ways actually the rate of exploitation is much higher than it is in Western countries, and especially if you look at Hong Kong, literally. I mean, it's kind of funny, they use that word constituencies because much of the issue there is because of Beijing's maintenance of a system that was originally set up by the British, whereby they'll literally have these constituencies where you'll have it's when people used to make jokes about a certain congressman as the congressman from General Motors or whatever.
Yep.
In Hong Kong's legislative body, they'll literally have that, right? There'll be industry groups
Yep.
who get representatives in the governing body. And again, I think that I can't imagine that given Michael Bloomberg's worldview, this kind of socially liberal in certain respects, deeply paternalistic, but also deeply authoritarian and deeply neoliberal. I can't imagine Michael Bloomberg looking at that and thinking anything other than, yeah, okay.
I mean, we know. Everybody should look up, and in fact, read From Third World to First World by Lee Kuan Yew, and look at how Fareed Zakaria, look at how the Davos world treated him. By the way, he was by certain objective terms, I mean, he was an incredibly effective leader, right? Like if we're being on the objective realm of things, the guy arguably, I mean, he created a peripheral post-colonial island state and turned it into a global powerhouse in every sense of the word, and invented a new model of authoritarianism, right? Which has been exported to much larger countries than his own. And I make this point, I mean, this is another point with understanding the dynamic right now between capitalism and the rise of neo-authoritarian, fascist tendency globally, is that in the authoritarian capitalist model, there is still some of that. There is that recognition that in some ways we need to be liberal and open because we need the best person for the job. So if you need the best person for the job, there is that function of capitalism weeding out. In global capitalism, it's we can have all sorts of distasteful beliefs and awful policies, but we need the guy from Nigeria or the woman from Malaysia and someone from Dallas to hit those numbers, period. And then, the authoritarian impulse says, wait a second, the pie is shrinking. We're in global hypercapitalism. We better create apartheid to preserve my traditional privilege structure, right? And that's why, I'm going off here, but another comparison I see is, it used to be that India and China were both fetishized like 10, 15 years ago. And it's very interesting because the folks that fetishized India, it was all capitalism. It was all look at these giant countries emerging and embracing the market and global oligarchy. That was the real story. But those that put a little bit more of a premium on doing it in a pluralistic way talked about India, and those that cared less for that and just wanted efficiency talked about China and Singapore. Well, China and Singapore are still central examples, and India is at the forefront of the global fascist wave. So, that should probably be a lesson for people.
No, absolutely. And, to your point earlier, I think this is something that a lot of leftists have trouble wrapping their minds around, that because it's sort of easier, I think, for a lot of people if we see all the stuff that we don't like as aligned with each other all the time.
Right.
Right. So it's like one big target.
Right.
And you're for it or you're against it. But of course, the reality is that obviously, as good leftists, we have all sorts of, we support, movements towards egalitarianism in all sorts of different realms, and, against traditional prejudices and bigotries. And the fact is that capitalism is sometimes, in some contexts, something that actually facilitates that.
Absolutely. Marx wrote that. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but yes, like we know this.
No, absolutely.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Marx got that right. A lot of people consider themselves, Marxists. Might sort of like to think that it's all, that it's all one thing, right? That if you're sort of that, like we don't like austerity, we don't like bigotry against gay or trans people, so therefore, right? Those must always line up with each other, but of course, often for its own reasons, the logic of markets will actually help break down the vestiges of reactionary and bigoted institutions. So the smarter critique of capitalism isn't, capitalism unambiguously, solely, always reinforces everything we don't like, because it doesn't. The smarter critique of capitalism is that we have, so the way society changes and evolves is dictated by the needs of markets, which sometimes works out to get results that we want and very often works out to get results that we don't want, instead of being dictated by the democratically expressed needs of ordinary people.
Exactly. Final thing that I just want to hit, Matt, throw this up. Let's always hit this stat. It's perfectly appropriate. Matt, take it away.
Well, we just got some numbers here. I don't know if I can see the numbers from here, but there's an article.
Can you make this larger?
I can, but I don't know if we'll be able to find it. But centrists,
yeah, go ahead.
Centrists are the most hostile to democracy and most authoritarian as far as, supporting this sort of stuff.
And this was written in May of 2018 by David Adler, who's a former guest on this show. And we'll be back on again soon.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, can you read that?
Yeah, let's see if I can.
Basically, yeah, these are really important numbers.
So if you look, the centrists are the most skeptical of democracy, is what the chart says. And you see who's supportive of democracy and who rates it highly. Center in many of the countries, not every single one of them, but are down on the prospect of democracy. So it's an interesting trend.
Yep. I think that's about it. Ben Burgis, as always, I appreciate you. Everybody, please buy Ben's great book. Everybody, check out Ben's great work. And we'll talk to you soon. Ben Burgis, thanks.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye. You just watched a Michael Brooks Show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.